Hey folks, Matt Easton here of Schola Gladiatoria channel in the UK. So we've got a really interesting comparison here between the longsword and the katana. Now, a lot's been said about longsword versus katana. They're swords that I suppose you can compare to some degree. They're both predominantly two-handed swords that were used in what we would call the Middle Ages, the medieval period. Obviously the longsword in Europe and the katana in Japan. In more modern times, the katana's got a real mystique about it and has become famous as an awesome cutter. Some of this undoubtedly is down to the way that the blades are manufactured and the fact that in Japan they have to go through a very, very lengthy manufacturing process to end up with a really top quality steel blade. However, European steel was no worse, and in some ways we could say that Europe was more blessed with better iron deposits with less impurities. And in actual fact, this means that blade manufacture in Europe could actually lead to springy sorts of steel blades that could be through tempered. So one of the first things to note about the katana is that generally speaking they're very hard at the edge. Usually antiques, originals are around 60 Rockwell at the edge. European swords vary more like 45 to 50 Rockwell historically at the edge. So yes, the katana does have a harder edge, which theoretically means it can have a sharper edge, or at least retain a sharper edge. However, the European sword does have an advantage over the traditionally made katana. Traditionally made katanas, the reason they have that wavy line along the edge, the hamon, is because the edge is hardened only, or the edge is hardened to a greater degree by the application of clay on the blade when it's quenched. And that does mean that while the edge is very, very sharp, the back of the blade is actually quite soft. European blades are through hardened and through tempered, which means that a European blade is like a spring. If you bend it, it will come back to straight again. Japanese blades, if you bend them, stay bent. So which sword is better? Well, obviously this is a question that, what context are we asking it in? Which is better for fighting in armour? Which is better for actually, a duel? Which is better for fighting in battle? Which is better for fighting in Japan? Which is better for fighting in Europe in the time periods that they were used? Weapons develop and evolve to fit the context that they fit into. But nevertheless, it is worth saying that each of these weapons have strengths and weaknesses. So as mentioned, European swords have the advantage that they have springy blades that return to straight when you bend them. Japanese swords have the advantage that they're harder at the edge. In terms of the actual physical shape and characteristics of the sword, as you can probably see on the screen, there is an advantage of length, of reach for the longsword. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but it's really important to state that when we're making these comparisons, we're making generalizations. Usually, katanas are shorter, usually they have sub 30-inch blades on them, and usually longswords have longer than 30-inch blades on them. Usually their blades are in the region of 35 to 40 inches. So generally speaking, there is a reach advantage for the longsword. In terms of the actual hilts, or the bits that you grip, essentially, the back end of the sword, the handles, they're of a similar sort of length, but you'll notice they have very different hand guards. Now, the cross guard of the European sword, we could say, is more protective than the small disc guard, the suba, of the katana. However, if we're looking purely at cutting mechanics and if we're looking at fighting zombies, then is a handguard that important? Really, we're looking at the blades and the leverage of the grips. Both of the grips are of a similar length and therefore give a similar amount of leverage. Something that's very important to mention with two-handed swords is that a lot of the leverage comes from the fact that you've got two hands on the grip. So one pushes and one pulls, or rather one pushes slightly more than the other pushes in reality. So the longsword and the katana actually have pretty similar length hilts, grips on them, which gives a similar degree of control and leverage. Having two hands on the grip not only means you've got a huge amount more leverage on the weapon, it also means you get tired out less quickly. So a one-handed sword actually can have longer reach, because you can reach further from your body with a one-handed sword than you can with a two-handed sword. However, using a one-handed sword is more tiring, and the power is only really coming from one arm and one wrist. When you've got two hands on the weapon, it's coming from your whole body and both arms and leverage, the magic of leverage. Now, coming back to that reach issue that I mentioned, it's really important to note that whilst the long swords tend to be a lot longer than the katana, look at the shapes of those tips. Very, very different shape tips of the blades for different purposes. The longsword is very, very narrow and pointy in this case. You do get some long swords which are broader at the point, but generally speaking, European swords, certainly of this kind of era, this kind of date, tend to be narrower and pointier at the end of the blade. This is for thrusting through various types of armour, predominantly padded armour and also mail, also known as chainmail. The Japanese point, however, whilst it can be used for thrusting through resistant materials, of course, it's a sharp point, any sharp point can go through that kind of stuff, it is really optimized for the cut. And what that means is that at the tip of the blade, you can still cut really, really effectively right the way up here. With the European sword, at least this example, and obviously there are various types of longsword in use in Europe, but with this example, you cannot really cut effectively up here at all. This is for thrusting. If you want to cut with a European longsword, the best portion to cut with, known as the centre of percussion, COP shortened, is down here. It's usually the third quarter of the blade. If you divide the blade up into quarters, the third quarter is the best part to cut with, around here. Okay. With a katana, you can cut with the central percussion, which again would be around here, but you can equally cut really, really, really well right the way up to the tip. So actually, if we compare these two blade types, whilst the longsword blade is definitely significantly longer, and for thrusting that's going to be an advantage if you're fighting another opponent with a sword, or certainly with a shorter sword, the centre of percussion, i.e. the portion of the blade which cuts the best, is actually quite similar. We notice it's in the third quarter up here on the longsword, and it's from essentially the third quarter to the end on the katana. Now, while you can of course hit something and attempt to cut with the tip of this blade at extreme range with the longsword, your chances of cutting much are not going to be great. So, which do we expect to perform the best in this experiment? So quite simply, I'm gonna pin my opinion to my chest. I think in this test, it very well may be that the katana performs better than the longsword, and that's for a number of reasons. Firstly, katanas are famously easy to cut with, okay? So when we do cutting sessions, when we have test cutting parties, this kind of stuff, often the katana is a good sword to give to a beginner. Now this might fly in the face of what lots of you have maybe been told. Maybe you've been told that katanas require lots of training and lots of expertise. Not true. Actually, someone who doesn't really know what they're necessarily doing with a sword and who isn't trained in swordsmanship will probably find the katana easier to cut with. And that's for a number of reasons. Firstly, the blade is short, but it is thick. Okay, so it's a similar weight to the longsword. This longsword is a little bit heavier than this katana. However, of course it's a bigger weapon, so we'd expect that. But with the katana, whilst it's shorter, it is actually quite a thick blade. That means it's stiff. A stiff blade is a very forgiving blade. It means that if we get our edge alignment at all messed up, anything other than perfect, the stiffer blade actually can drag through the target and still cut fairly well. The other reason is for the reason I mentioned, that due to where the weight distribution of this is and the fact that it's still quite thick at the tip and the shape of the tip and you know, the point of balance and these kind of things, this sword, this type of sword, most katanas, not all katanas are the same, but most katanas cut very, very well from about that portion of the blade all the way to the tip. So that means, again, it's very forgiving. It means that not only does the cutter not have to worry too much about the edge alignment. Obviously if they get the edge alignment perfect, then it will cut better. But if they mess up a bit, then this type of blade is more forgiving. But additionally, if they hit at a different region along the blade, it's still going to cut well. Going to the longsword, however, longswords are, if I just tap this blade, you can see they are flexible, because in order to get that extra length, the blade has distal taper. That means it gets thinner and thinner and thinner towards the tip, generally speaking. Or it tapers in that portion of the blade, so in silhouette essentially. It starts off broad and tapers down here. That is so that the weight distribution can still be manageable as a quick weapon, as a fighting weapon, but you can get as much blade length as possible, primarily to use the point for thrusting, but to increase your cutting range as well. But that does mean that when we're cutting against various targets, for someone who's maybe not trained to use a longsword so well, they will find this more of a challenging sword to cut with than the katana. First of all, it's got that wobble, so if it's not so stiff as the katana, which means if you get the edge alignment slightly off, the blade's going to flex, and that's going to go against your cutting form. Additionally, the region of the blade that can cut effectively, I would argue, is shorter on a longsword than it is on a katana. If someone hits with the tip of the blade, they're going to cut really, really badly. They really need to be cutting down here. Conversely, the fact that this blade is narrow does mean that if we get the edge alignment right, and if we cut with the correct portion of the blade, actually, once the blade is passing through the target, it's actually less resistance, because of course a thinner blade is less resistance than to the material that we're cutting through compared to a thicker blade. Having said that, my experience is that most of the time, most people find katanas easier to cut with. Now finally, the curve of the blade, does that make a big difference? It makes a very, very slight difference. I would argue that it doesn't make very much of a big difference at all. People think that the curve of a katana makes a big difference, but actually, as you can see, katana blades, certainly of this sort of 19th century type, are not very curved at all. And it actually helps, having a slightly curved blade actually helps you to sharpen it more easily, and it does very slightly mean that the portion of contact between the edge and the target is slightly smaller, and therefore the force is more concentrated. It does also aid slightly with the draw through the target and the slicing effect, but you get that with a straight blade, and you get that with a tapered blade as well. So I would say that the curve adds a little bit of extra cutting power, but not very much, and katanas are not very curved. Not as curved as things like the tulwar behind me, for example. While the reduced length of the blade means a reduced speed at the tip, it does mean that because the weapon's overall a little bit lighter, a little bit shorter, it does mean that lots of people will find it easier to accelerate to a quick speed more quickly. We should remember though that the longsword has equal leverage, a longer blade, so faster tip speed, and it's only a little bit heavier really than the katana, so it's still a quick and nimble sword that can move quickly through the target. The basic body mechanics of cutting with a katana and a longsword are not very different at all. We've got similar length grips, similar-ish weapons. We've got to think about edge alignment, how we twist and turn the body, how we lay our foot. Ideally, the foot of the side that we're cutting from should land, or at least be forward, at the same moment that we land the strike. Really, the most critical things to making these cuts effective are speed of the blade, so accelerating the sword as quickly as possible, and that comes from the body mechanics, and edge alignment. If the edge isn't aligned, it doesn't matter whether it's a longsword or a katana, it's not going to cut well. A lot has been said about the so-called drawing cut, or drawing pulling of the blade towards you with the katana. In actual fact, this applies to all swords, and if you look at the arc of the arms, the natural arc of an arm, it doesn't matter what type of sword it is, it will naturally produce a drawing effect anyway. So actually for a layman, for a non-swordsman, for someone who isn't trained with either the katana or the longsword, the effect of using one or the other isn't going to be very different. They're going to cut in a similar way and it's going to have similar effects. The differences will really come from sharpness, speed of the blade, and edge alignment. With the katana, there are two factors that are really important here. One is that the centre of percussion is essentially all the way to the tip, and even the tip can cut well, and the thickness and stiffness of the blade mean that it's more forgiving if the edge alignment isn't perfect. So I think that for most people, most of the time, a katana is going to be more easy to cut more effectively. Having said that, we must remember that this is a very limited test. This is really only testing which cuts most effectively, regardless of range or distance or any other kind of fighting conditions. In a real fight, you've got to remember that the longsword has a very real reach advantage with the point and to a degree with the edge, but it has a better handguard on it. It has a flexible blade that won't get bent if you mess up a cut or someone stands on it or something like this. So the longsword has other advantages to it. It is not that the katana is per se a better sword, but I think in this test, and this might go for viewers of my channel, this might go against what people expect me to say, I think for this test the katana will probably outperform the longsword.